Hey, Hefe, how you doing, buddy?
Hey, Mookie, nice to talk to you again.
Hey, I'm feeling pretty good today.
Excellent. What's
I'm
going on
I'm
for you?
I'm feeling all transition-y. I'm trying to evolve my career from
Uh-huh.
over by there to over by here.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I'm used to doing work, and
Right.
now I want to do work that's more like play work or play
Awesome.
work. Yeah,
Yeah,
and this
I'm a great supporter of transitioning from doing work to doing playful work and finding joy in the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. Awesome.
All right. And I think that our podcast is a step in that direction. And I understand that you have known somebody in the alternative sexuality community now for decades. And this guy has made his own kind of transition. Is that true?
This is true. This is 100% true.
Awesome. And we could talk to him?
I think we can make that happen.
All right, let's give it our best shot. Hello, and welcome to the Bald and Bodacious podcast. I am your bald host, Mookie Spitz, and my bald co-host, Hefe, is eager to introduce.
Well, I'd love to share with you introduction to my friend Max, who I have known for going on 20 years now. And he was willing to make some time to chat with us today. Are you there, Max?
And I'm sure delighted to be here, Hefe.
Awesome. Welcome.
Thanks for joining us. And along the lines of the theme that I was hinting at earlier, career evolution, Hefe mentioned that you were an IT guy, an IT professional, IT consultant, and you gradually pivoted into a different kind of life. Can you share with us where you've been, where you are, and where things are headed?
I sure can because I'm perpetually excited about it. I will. Before I do that, I'm going to go back to the other theme for just a minute because I'm like three-quarters bald, and I'm doing my best to get there. I want you to know that so we can like bond over that.
All right, so it's a
Um,
triple. It's a triptych of bald, folks,
I mean,
that we're
it might be like two
bringing
and three
you.
quarters, but yeah,
All
we'll call it
right,
that.
all right,
I'll send a picture later.
great.
So I've yeah, I'm have finished a lifelong IT career that was rewarding and successful, and never felt like it made the world better. Exactly, I think I avoided making the world worse, but I don't think I made the world better with that really. Um, and simultaneously with that, I've been teaching and coaching and deeply involved in kink community. Found that community in '92 and started teaching in '99 and have been slowly ramping that up. And about 10 years ago, kind of hit the knee of that curve, and I've been ramping it up pretty quickly and with great joy, especially for the last 5 years or so. And that is 100% of what I do now is kink and sexuality and relationship and consent teaching and coaching.
What inspired the pivot? Because in my selfish case, I was like you. I still am. I'm still doing the consultancy, but I've always felt that creativity and content and exploration was who I am as a person. I always felt this vacuum that needed to be filled. What compelled you to pivot, and how did you pull that pivot off?
I'm almost reluctant to call it a pivot because it was a lot of it was so gradual. I mean, I've taught 500 or 600 workshops since '99, so it's not like I just started. There was an inflection point, but it was also pretty substantial curve until then. And what inspired the pivot, if you will, was ability, right? Which is mainly about money and to some extent about just time and interest. I was treating my coaching and my teaching as a small business and sort of giving it the respect and time and attention it needed for that. And I've been doing that for 15 years at least. And 10 years ago kind of went, no, this is actually what I want to be doing as a primary function, and I want to leave the IT stuff behind.
Not every IT pro I know is into BDSM or fetishes or all the interesting things that you're about to tell us all about. How have you felt about those? Why do you think that you do what you do? Where does it come from?
Well, this is the age-old question. The first thing I would have to note, Mookie, is your statement may or may not be true that not every IT pro that you know is kinky, uh, right? You may not know it, right? And I'm not speaking for them, but I think there's a lot of us out there. There's this interesting definition of like what's kink, and some people define it as like weird stuff that other people do, and once you do it, it's not kink, it's just kind of what you do. What I'm certain of is that all three of us know what a Venn diagram is because we're all geeky, right? And if you draw a Venn diagram with kinky and geeky, I think it's almost a circle. I think kink tends to attract and appeal to people who like structure, who like methodologies, who like um, formalizing, who like discussion and negotiation.
Who like
Um,
really digging into something, who like, going down that rabbit hole.
yeah,
Yeah, Star Trek cosplay is in that center area of kink and geek.
yeah. So I think it's a lot broader than tech people, but I think many tech people and medical people, interestingly, I think are overrepresented in kink and alternative sexuality communities.
So, Max, I'm curious when you talk about these past 10 years, obviously, the past 5 years have presented a very different landscape and worldview for teaching, for education, for connection, for kink. And I'm wondering, since you put the shift and the change on a higher plane 10 years ago, how has the last 5 years played out differently than, for example, the 5 years before that?
Well, that's a great question. I've I have fortunately had some I don't know, let's call it rebranding, but it's been sort of evolution of my focus over this whole period. When I first started teaching, it was almost 100% rope bondage because I loved tying people up. Rope is kind of the gateway drug for a lot of people. It's broadly, lots of people like being tied up. It's pretty broadly attractive to lots of people, both for topping, doing the tying, and for bottoming, getting tied up. And over time, that evolved into other kink skills. And then over time, that evolved into sort of kink relationship. And so then, yeah, there was this pandemic thing that happened in 2020, and I pretty much on a dime. I mean, I literally had a workshop scheduled, and the day before the workshop in early March, I said, I don't think it's a good idea to do this in person. And so I refunded everybody's money and created a Zoom version of the same workshop and said, if you want to buy a cheaper ticket for this Zoom based workshop, do it. And so that was my transition to online education, was like one day's notice. And conveniently, lots of the things that I do work great remotely. Probably, a bunch of my clientele still is remote. Things like teaching people how to do rope bondage does not work well remotely. And so there's absolutely been an evolution. And I had, of course, spent a decade thinking, oh, I should do online classes, and then got shoved into it with some vigor by the pandemic lockdowns.
What's the
Well,
relationship between your pedagogy and your practice? So we talked about this Venn diagram with the overlap between techies and geekies and kinkies. What about the overlap between techie, geeky, kinkies and coaching, teaching? That sounds like a different aspect of self.
Yes and no. I have an amazing former partner who used to talk about kink as graduate level sexuality, and I think I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think engaging in kink tends to be, I mean, it can be profoundly erotic, although it doesn't have to be. It often is not. It's deeply intimate, but it's also thoughtful in a way that sort of just jumping into bed doesn't have to be. And so it's an easy transition from a personal practice of kink, which is In some cases, highly sexual. In all cases, almost all cases, intimate. But also involves like conceptual models and structure and how we're going to do it kinds of discussions. And so that translates pretty easily to teaching, to coaching, to sort of, stepping away from it and talking about it in addition to just being in it, if that kind of addresses your question.
Sure. And just for our listeners, what kind of topics do you cover? So if someone comes up to Professor Max of Kinkology, what does the syllabus look like? What does a course plan look like? What's in it for them, and how do you offer your goods?
Yeah, thank you. The syllabus has probably got, I don't know, 80 or 90 separate courses in it that I've taught over the years and can sort of pull up. There's a category of courses that are kinky technical skills, if you will, mainly things you do with your hand, like rope or throwing a whip or play piercing with needles or playing with electrical zappy toys, all those kinds of things. Then there's a whole set of kinky things about building kinky relationship and, for instance, doing service, which is, not coincidentally also a love language, or building deliberate authority transfer relationships where you play with dominance and submission in consensual ways. And so all of that used to be 100%. It's now probably a third of my practice. I spend a bunch of my time playing with hypnosis because about a decade ago, I was exposed to an erotic hypnosis subcommunity and realized that I had been doing it all along and I should be more deliberate and better at it. So there's an element of playing with hypnosis, both explicitly and also the notion of reframing an experience is a powerful part of my coaching practice. And then there's also a whole bunch that's just about identifying your own desires and building relationship and talking about desire and consent. And that's all of that is profoundly influenced by a woman named Dr. Brandy Martin, who talks about the wheel of consent.
So it sounds like
So,
you're a hybrid between the logistics, the technicalities of teaching people how to tie someone up, all the way to the psychological elements of kink itself and the rationale and the benefit. Is that right?
Absolutely. And the hook for what most people find at the beginning is that they're drawn to a thing like I want to get tied up, right? Or I want to tie my partner up. And pretty quickly you discover that it's more than a physical act. There are psychological and emotional dimensions. And over a little bit of time, decades for some people and days for some people, you discover that the psychological and emotional pieces actually are the important part.
so Max, I want to back up for a sec because something that you said really resonated with me. Mookie, you are going down a really productive path here. But before we go a lot further that way, one of the things that you said, Max, was this concept of BDSM or kink as like a master's degree and the level of sophistication. And one of the things that I have seen over the last handful of years, both on FetLife, for example, or also like in the Reddit BDSM personals. So I actually just called up the Reddit BDSM personals to look at it. And the first 30 listings, out of the first 30 listings, only 5 of them are from people older than 30. So we've got basically 25 out of 30 listings for people aged 18 to 29. And it's certainly something that I see on FetLife as well. When you look at the personal ads, you've got a tremendous amount of ads from people who have not yet reached that level of graduate degree. And I'm wondering, how do we talk to folks that maybe haven't gotten there yet and really are going to look at folks like the three of us and say, oh, you old people, you don't know anything. We've got it. We've got this. And just because it took you decades to figure this stuff out doesn't mean that we can't do this when we're 22, 23, 24, 25.
So I will bookmark if you want to go back to it later. There's this whole notion of like how the kink community has changed over the 30 years I've been able to observe it. And to answer the specific question, I mean, young people are absolutely, of course, able to engage in this and able to do it in thoughtful ways. I think on the one hand, I'm 68. I have 30 years of kink experience. If you do the math, I was in my mid 30s before I even discovered this because the information that was available to me, to us probably, was so crummy, right? I mean, there was no internet and there was like a book that I found, and finding community was like going around to bars and then finding somebody and then, sending them a stamp envelope. And I mean, it was very, very difficult to find community, and it's so easy to find community now. It's a Google search that people are in many ways starting, able to start earlier and be more effective with their learning. Me, a year into my kink experience, and somebody else who's current a year into their kink experience, they may actually have a lot more experience and certainly they have more resources available. Also, sort of like a pilot, there is the notion of like learning to do the skills involved with the thing, and then there is the maturity, both in terms of the skill and the underlying emotional maturity to like how do you handle an unexpected event, right? Do you have reflexes that are built, or do you just have a set of skills that you've learned? And that just takes seat time, just like it does for flying an airplane. And so then there's a second question of like, how do I show value? How do we show value as, old farts to a 25-year-old? And I think the answer is people discover that or they don't. I mean, much of my clientele is much younger than I am. Also, there's a whole section of my clientele that's, my age. But people often kind of get to a dead end. I mean, I was on a cruise 2 days ago, and that was a fetish cruise here in Seattle, and I ran into two people who were super interested in rope, and they had a bag because it was supposed to be a play party, although there wasn't a lot of that. They had a bag, they had a piece of rope in it, and they had been looking at YouTube videos to learn how to tie. Mm-hmm. And so there's information available. They were enthusiastic, and we talked about it a little bit. And there was a couple, and I said, would you like to do some rope together? And so I did, I don't know, 20 minutes of rope in this very public setting, and kind of part instructional, part experiential. And I think I sort of shifted their understanding of like, oh, there's more to learn, right? And it's not like the YouTube learning doesn't have value, but there are dimensions that are hard to get through those venues. And so when people go, oh, I've sort of run through this learning path that I have available to me, and I'm still interested, then they find me or other resources like me.
Now, when you and I first met, I think that we met through an organization. We met through a center in Seattle, which had a charismatic leader, and it had many people that were coming together on the regular. I myself have been part of this community, so to speak, in a variety of different places, in Texas, in Northern California, in Washington State, to a lesser degree in Illinois, now in New York. And one of the things that I'm noticing, and I'm not certain whether it's a function of geography or a function of time, but I feel like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the locations that I was in each had this sort of community space where people came together, they got to know one another, and there was some sort of maybe like an orientation that you could trust people had gone through in order to be welcomed into this space, different from now where people are going to YouTube or Reddit or FetLife. They were actually coming into a physical space and encountering other human beings. Today, yep, at least here in New York, there are so many different organizations, and each one has a different sort of motivating or driving theory or mission. And instead of having a necessary orientation, which created something of a obstacle to get in, they all want to bring in as many people as possible. And it seems like the steps necessary to participate are significantly reduced. And it seems like there's a willingness to bring in folks with less knowledge, less education. And I'm wondering if you have seen that shift over the last 10 years, or if this is primarily simply me being in a different geography.
Yeah, I have seen exactly that shift very much in Seattle, where I've been for decades, and also when I travel and when I talk to people. And I think there's a really specific thing that's happened. I think when you and I started, I mean, I'll speak to my own experience, but when I started, I it was hard to find community. The only reason I found it is like I really wanted it. It was important to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there was a filter there of like sort of dilettantes didn't find it because it took work to find it and effort to get let in. Um, and so when I found it, because the funnel was sort of narrow, I would show up at a party, for instance, and there would be 50 people at this party, and there would be five of us who were pretty new and 45 people who were pretty experienced. And so it wasn't even necessarily that there was like an orientation meeting, but I could look around me and I could see what was normative behavior, what was acceptable behavior, because everybody in the room was sort of doing it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if there was, and if somebody strayed, I mean, to be specific, if I strayed, and I like went over and touched somebody's toy bag, somebody would come over and say, "That's not how we do that."
Mm-hmm.
And I'd go, "Oh, right, of course." As I look around, nobody's doing that, right? And so that culturally I was stepping into a relatively well-defined culture with norms and values and boundaries and rules at some level. And it's, I don't want to like overstate it, but there was a sort of right and wrong way to do it, and everybody I looked at was doing it right-ish. And so as the barriers to entry became lower with internet and all of that, the proportion of those people changed. And so if I go to a party today, probably half of the people are very new, and a
Mm-hmm.
quarter of them are pretty new, and a quarter of them maybe have substantial experience. And so it's not, if I look around the room as a new person, I don't even know which people to model.
Yeah, I was very, very fortunate. I moved from Texas to San Francisco, and it's possible that the existence of alt sex bondage on Usenet may be why so many geeks are doing this today. And I posted on alt sex bondage that I was moving to San Francisco and I was looking for new friends and new connections. And I would love to buy somebody coffee. You know who answered my post and shared coffee with me? It was Janet Hardy did.
That's so right.
So for those who don't know, and we can share this in the notes, Janet is the author of the new topping book and the new bottoming book. She is at the time she ran a press, a book publishing company that published SM 101. She was the author of The Ethical Slut. So I was terrifically fortunate very, very early on to be introduced to others and to people by somebody who really played a role in the type of education that you're describing. So I was terrifically fortunate. And again, it's possible that Usenet and those sorts of things really helped shape the fact that a lot of people that went down that particular alleyway were tech forward because they had access to those resources.
Well, what's being lost though? I was a manager of an alternative sex club back in the 90s. And at that point, it was more or less pre-internet, pre-smartphone. And where the action was happening was at the bar, on the street, and for some people in the alleys. It was visceral, it was physical, and it was immediate. And to your exact point, Max, there were norms, there were boundaries, there were rules. From a normie point of view, it was wonderland. It was through the looking glass. But
Right.
there was a community, there were rules, there were participants, and a vast majority were seasoned veterans of the scene. Fast forward, I went to go visit the same club that I used to manage. only a few years ago. And it was a completely different scene. Everyone was, of course, a generation or two younger, but it was relatively sparse in terms of sheer volume. And it was relatively sedate and milquetoast because essentially not only had the neighborhood become gentrified, but the scene itself. It was no longer an alternative ghetto of
Yes.
this kind of sexuality. It became normalized, it became mainstream. So how do you feel about this increased availability of communication? About you're not like sharing envelopes to gain connection. You're going online, and within seconds you can connect to people. Within seconds, in any city in America, you could get yourself invited to a sex party. So obviously there's benefit, but what's been lost? And can we find a happy medium between keeping it special, keeping it real, and commoditizing it?
Well, that is the question, and I don't. I've been thinking about this question for 2 decades, and I don't know. I mean, the trade off. I think you stated the trade off well. There is benefit to accessibility and democratization, right? It's like I worked so hard, and it was so important to me to find community, and it was. I mean, it was like painfully difficult to find, and I'm glad that it's not as painfully difficult for people who want it and need it. And also, the result of that has been it's bland, right? It has become uh, it's not just that everybody's doing the edgy things and that's been normalized. It's that the average level of intensity, whatever, in the room is much lower. And so one of the things that's happened, in at least in my first and secondhand experience, is highly experienced people and people who want to play hard have fled community and are playing. It looks like 40 years ago or 30 years ago, they're playing at home with a friend, and maybe they invite another friend over, another couple over, or do a little tiny private party. And the larger community things have gotten so diverse. And I think there's a sweet spot here. I think if you're ignoring the internet for a moment, but even with that, if you're in a very tiny town, if you're in a town of 1,000 people, it is hard to build kink community in person, right? Ignoring online. And if you're in Seattle for a while, was in this beautiful sweet spot of there were enough people to like have enough people to actually, fund spaces and have enough people to show up and make events. But it was a small enough group that we sort of did it together. And so there was this lovely melting pot of gay men and lesbians and queer people and sort of, we didn't even have language around trans at the time, but cross dressers and gender indeterminate people and butches and there were certainly spaces that were reserved for segments of that community, but it was common to have all of that group together, and so there was some cohesion. And then as you grow, there's enough people with a particular sub-interest to say, screw you guys, we're going to do our own thing over here with our own party or our own website or our own space. And so you lose that broader community feeling and it becomes splintered. And that's, I think, one of the other things that happen is there's this splintering and there's also this watering down.
I think that watering down that you're describing really, in my experience, ties in to the comment you made about people don't have to work so hard to get invited, to get in. I think that in marketing or tech, we talk about like a barrier to entry, and there's a much lower barrier to entry, and there's a lot of advantages to that if you like are deeply kinky and you realize this about yourself. It's much easier to find a community and become connected. But the flip side of that particular coin is if you're not really that interested and you're just sort of like looking for something to do on a Friday night and you don't have that level of personal investment or personal interest, it's still easy to find something to do on a Friday night. And I think that the opportunity for people like that to, let's say, invade kink spaces makes it so that this experience that you described, where half the people there have never been to a party before, it's much easier for that to happen.
Yeah. And in fact, there's an interesting, I want to inject the notion of safety into this in an unusual way. there's lots and lots of discussion now about building safe places and making events safe. And what that usually means is it means we want people not to be taken advantage of. We want people to have their autonomy and their consent respected. And so we want to gear everything very slowly and very explicitly to support those objectives.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a dear friend who's a very competent old school leather dyke from Vancouver, BC, who actually gave a talk at an event a year ago. And the premise of her talk really was that she and her highly experienced peers who want to play hard and want to be intense in their interactions and in their physical play, that she does not feel safe in these spaces because she feels people look at her intensity and they recoil from it, and they are judgmental about it, and so she actually does not feel safe because the level of what's normal has dropped so low, which is an interesting, different way to look at this, as opposed to people are playing so hard that I, as a new person, don't feel safe.
That sounds paradoxical in ways. On the one hand, you have lower barrier of entry, just like Hefe mentioned. On the other, the Jack White observation that ease of use is the death knell of the creative spirit. So once you homogenize and commoditize anything, then it loses its charm. But what I'm also hearing is this feeling that those who do want to explore and maybe take things to the next inevitable and logical level might be a little bit hindered because that barrier of entry has come down. It's almost like it's a lowest common denominator of, to Hefe's point again, the Friday night kinkster who might just want a one-off and has limited to no experience.
Yeah, I mean there are a lot of experienced people who have either fled the sort of public community, or they show up and they chat with people and they catch up with friends, but they don't play in public, because what happens when they play is, things happen, like they get interrupted by what's called a dungeon manor, who's kind of like a facilitator in a space, and they're told they need to stop what they're doing because it's unsafe or it's inappropriate or it appears to be violent, or it triggers someone in some way. And so many people have given up, many experienced people have given up playing hard in public spaces when that's the reason they used to go.
So let's talk for a minute about these playing hard and monitoring, because I think that there are, I know for certain there are people that play very hard who have shifted to playing in their homes. And also, certainly here in New York, and you and I, Max, have an acquaintance in common who is no longer part of the community because he is now a guest of the state of Washington as a result of doing things that genuinely were really horrible. Just a couple of years before quarantine, 2018, 2019, there was this big movement around Me Too. And I think that flushed a lot of experienced people out of the community. And I think in many cases, to the better for all of us. But I also think that there are people that were and are like caring, thoughtful, consent forward, but they play hard and maybe they ruffled some feathers. Talk to me a little bit about how we balance making sure that the community legitimately is safe for people who don't want to get into an abusive or non-consensual situation, and also is able to accommodate those of us who might want to do something that is a little bit more out of the ordinary.
I'll start by saying I think we should all stop saying the versions of the thing you just said about making communities safe, because I think that's not possible and it's not a reasonable objective. I mean, nothing is safe.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason that all the sexually transmitted disease folks stop talking about safe sex and
Safer.
now safer sex.
Yeah.
Thank you. Exactly. Right. I mean, the most dangerous thing we do is we drive cars, right? And we get on buses and, ground transportation. So I think the problem with talking about making a space safe is in fact that A, it's impossible, and B, it encourages people not to manage their own safety, right? So so let me just sort of pause with that for a minute, but I think it's a thing. The other thing I'll note is that my partner Mariana, who is vastly experienced, is perpetually sad and disappointed about the fact that she goes into spaces, and if we play hard, and I mean I could talk about what that might even look like, but if we play hard, people will come up sometimes and say, "Oh, honey, are you okay?" Right? And in not in helpful ways, but in ways that are really diminish her agency and are paternalistic and are exactly the things we say we don't want. That what happens is people presume that she's 58 years old and she's got decades in kink and she's like highly competent professionally, right? She's a kick-ass woman, and people assume that she must be being taken advantage of in some way, and they need to speak for her without asking. And so that's kind of what this notion of safety has led to. It is perversely disempowering for people who want to bottom,
Hmm.
right?
It's fascinating from a political point of view, and this, of course, we don't want to go into any kind of political ground, but the parallel analog is striking in the sense of the backlash to the backlash to the backlash of the Me Too, as Hefe mentioned, the wokeism, where people with the very, very, very best of intentions end up shooting their own constituents in the foot, which is this overly compensatory, ironically paternalistic attitude coming from those who are the least experienced in the trials and tribulations of others. And it seems like the kink community, as you describe it, is dealing with some of these same tensions, which is again coming at it with the best intentions possible, yet out of context to the point where it ruins the experience for just about everybody.
Yep, yep. I think that nails it. And I would offer like an example or maybe an analogy and a resource here. The example, and this is sort of
We love resources. Resources are great.
excellent. Yeah, and I'll make a note to make sure I send you a link. So the example is, somewhere in the middle of the women's movement, what I noticed that people who chose to like stay home and raise a child and be a housewife actually came under attack. And what we really wanted out of feminism is for women, just like men, to have agency and to have choices and to decide what they wanted to do with their time and their energy and their lives, right? And so it is true that we don't want women to be forced to stay home and not work and raise children and make a home. But it's not true that we want to prohibit that or diminish that if people choose to do that. So there is this analog in kink community, and as you sort of alluded to in many spaces, where it's like in the effort to protect people, we've become paternal. And instead of giving them power and saying, we want to make sure that you have the resources to decide what you want to be and how you want, what you want to be when you grow up and what you want to do and how you want to live your life, we say, it looks like you're being abused, and so we're not going to let you be this thing. We want you to be this other thing. Every woman should have a job and not stay at home. And that is actually not feminism either. As an example, there is an endless debate that just every couple of years it kind of goes around in the kink communities about what's called age gap relationships.
Mm.
And right. And so the notion is you have someone who is older than someone else, right? And so, let's just start with nobody in any kink community that I am part of or have been part of advocates playing with people who are under the age of consent, right? This is all about people who are 18 plus or 21 plus. There is a whole segment of the kink community that believes that if there's a 10-year age gap, say, I mean, let's say a 30-year-old and a 45-year-old, that it's inherently abusive, or a 25-year-old and a 35-year-old. What that really says is that that 25-year-old is deemed to be incompetent and unable to represent themselves and make decisions about their own life. And what's true is that I believe I make better decisions now than I did when I was 25. And also, when I was 25, I was signing contracts and I was driving and I could join the military if I wanted to. And I was already married, right? I was making big decisions about my life at 25. And right or wrong, I was allowed to do that. And in fact, told, I must do that, right? And so there is this judgment with this age gap relationship thing that says, we're worried about you being taken advantage of, and so we're going to remove your agency and say, no, you actually shouldn't do this thing, and we will frown upon you, and we will say that you're being abused because we don't trust the decisions that you are making. And that's just like telling a woman that they're not allowed to work in the house, right? It's not really what we wanted to do.
I just want to dovetail off of that because it gets to the core of some of the essence of BDSM. And the reason I'd love to focus on this for a second from the Maestro Max is you bring up this idea of potential abuse of boundaries, right? Of unequal power relationships. A woman is 25 years old, the man is 45, the man is 55. And therefore it's construed as inherently abusive and problematic. But doesn't that beg the question of the essence of much of the kink play? You've got a dominant and a submissive. That is inherently a power relationship. So, do you guys mind if we explore that for a second? Because I think that gets to the heart of what we're trying to get at
Yeah,
here,
yeah,
which
yeah, yeah.
you see where I'm headed, which
Oh, yeah.
is,
I talk about this all the time. I give
yeah,
speeches about this. I teach about this. So let me define a term here. Let me define two terms. There is the notion of what's called structural power, and structural power is power that exists in the world just inherently based on what's going on and who we are. So examples of structural power might include racial differences, right? White, black. It might include income differences. It might include education. It might include age. It might include gender, right? So there's structural power everywhere. There is, men in general have structural power over women. Rich people have structural power over poor people. What we should do, and generally, I think most people in kink community work to do with some degree of thoughtfulness, is when we decide to play with power, what we do is we take the structural power and we do our best to set it aside and now say, okay, we think playing with power is hot in some way. How do we construct an authority-based relationship, or what I like to call a power exchange relationship, where we start out as equals and we agree that I'm going to give you 10% of my power because I like it when you boss me around, or I like it when you pin me down in bed, or I like serving you, right? And so it's important to just make this distinction between negotiated power and structural power. And you can't make structural power go away. I mean, even amongst the three of us, we're whitish, oldish men with decent incomes, and still, I bet we could find ways where one of us has more power than the other. There's always power. The trick is to say we're not going to do it because of power. So for instance, I'm a boy and my partner Mariana is a girl, and we have decided that we are building a power-based relationship because we like it, and we've spent almost a decade building that every day. We don't build it because I'm a boy and she's a girl. We build it because we think it's hot, right? And I know just as many power-based relationships that work sort of against the structural power, right? Mine works as it happens in the same direction of the structural power. There are lots of women tops and male bottoms who want to be, men who want to be directed and submissive and of service. And so they have sort of a different set of problems because they're working against type. right? And so they need to sort of resist the stereotypes that want to intrude in their lives and be thoughtful about, like, no, we're doing it this way. The woman's in charge. And I actually need to be careful not to just glide along on the stereotypes, but to be thoughtful and deliberate with my partner about how we do power.
And that's the whole point, in a sense, right? Which is kind of a play acting. It's taking the rules that society have incurred upon us, biological rules, behavioral rules. And then in these controlled, consensual settings, we acknowledge these rules because they're inevitable and they're a part of our lives, but now it's playtime. We can manipulate them. We could do things with them for the sake of pleasure, enjoyment, indulgence, and self actualization. To me, that gets to the heart of a lot of what we're talking about.
I, I agree, and I'd like to push gently on the word play. I think play is important. I think we don't get enough play, right? We somehow lose that as we grow up, and it's important. And also, many people do this in ways that are very deliberate and very real life. They are impactful in how they live their life every day, and they
Max, I want
build.
to back that up. And the other word I want to throw in here is intention. I think there's a lot of intentionality when we question some of these elements of the structural issues of power. And again, backing up what you said about being careful about using the word play, and yes, and my partner, if we've watched a TV show and the show is over and I'm ready to go to bed, I may say to my partner, "Hey, I'm going to bed. I would love it if you would come join me." And that seems great and lovely and inviting and kind. But you know what? When my partner arrives in bed, my experience has been that sometimes she will come with a very sad face. And I'll say, "Hey, what's wrong?" And her response is something along the lines of, "I kind of wanted you to tell me to come to bed." And that's not play. That's the way we live our lives.
Yep.
So how do you draw a boundary? This is very, very interesting. It's edifying for me, and I bet some real greenbacks that it's edifying on the part of a lot of listeners. Where do you draw the boundary, if you draw a boundary between, just as Hefe described, a dynamic of interpersonal relationship that is day in, day out, and just part of the quotidian, and going to a party where you are, air quote, playing a role, or you're, air quote, with intention, performing some of the feats that you train.
Yeah. Juicy stuff. And like, you've just hit the middle of my coaching practice. So thank you. Um, so, so let me introduce another term. Remember me saying this was like heady, graduate level sex? Here we are, right? It's like, and I love these discussions. Also, I love your diction. So the word I'd like to introduce is compliance. Compliance is when you say yes when you should have said no. And it's, to be clear, it's a bad thing, right? So compliance is, a lot of consent injuries, consent violations, people feeling pushed, is about compliance, and it's not just about sex. If you work at McDonald's and you're a minimum wage employee, and your supervisor comes up and says, "Hey Max, it's Friday, and I'm kind of sorry, but we had somebody cancel, and I need you to work all day Saturday and Sunday." That's okay, isn't it? And I had a birthday party for myself that I was going to attend on Saturday, but I feel like I'm going to lose my job if I say no. What I'm going to say is, "Oh, uh, yeah, that's fine, boss. Thanks. I could use the hours. That's great." So that's me saying yes when I really should have said no, but I felt pressured to say yes for reasons. And the reasons are structural power, right? The reasons are economic, racial, physical size, right? So, so what we want to do is we want to avoid compliance. but we still often want to play with power. I mean, the most common fantasies, sexual fantasies for men and for women, are about being overpowered, and sexual fantasies around rape, around abduction, around power. Nobody wants to be raped or abducted, right? But the notion of playing with power is hot, and people want to fold that into fantasies. They want to fold it into play, and many people want to fold it into their real life, into their identities. So then the question is, how do we do that? And the answers include thinking about, what is your desire, right? Thinking about, am I just lurching into playing with power because, like, well, you're a girl and I'm a boy, and so you should make me dinner? Or is it like, no, we're both capable of making dinners, and regardless of gender, I really enjoy the notion of serving you dinner. Then, okay, then let's do that because we both want it. Anytime we talk about authority, there's the notion of scope. So, for instance, I have a history, 3 decades of pretty substantial power exchange relationships with partners. Not all of my partners, but many of them. And my current partner has 2 adult children. I've had other partners with younger children. I am in a position to do things like say, we're going to turn off the TV and go to bed now. And my partner will say yes to that. And if there's a reason that they can't, we'll get into that in a minute, they'll say, I can't do that because of XYZ. I would never tell my partners how to manage their relationships with their children. It is out of scope, if you will. So even though I have substantial authority in many areas of our lives, there are areas that are out of bounds. And so that's one of the ways you manage it, is to sort of not run over things that are inappropriate places to exercise authority in a relationship.
And I'm guessing there's variability in terms of role playing. So, for example, someone might be a proverbial pillow princess, a sub in every way, but when it comes to affairs that are non-intimate, they can rule the roost. So we have variable roles vis-a-vis our power relationships as well. And this could add to some of the fun and connection, but they can also engender a certain amount of confusion as well.
Absolutely. And the confusion is simple to fix. You just talk about it and make agreements, right? Which sounds easier than it is, of course. But the joy here, the intimacy here really doesn't come from having power in the bedroom. The intimacy comes from taking the time and the thoughtfulness to assess yourself and to talk to your partner and to actually have communication about, like, I like being pinned down in the bed and fucked and used, but don't tell me what to do the rest of the time. And in fact, I think it's your turn to go empty the dishwasher. Go, right? And having agreements around what's appropriate and what's allowed there.
I
I want to introduce another concept, if I may. Can I keep going down this rabbit hole?
Yes, please. I love this transparency and communication and its impact
Yeah.
on relationships. I think this is the heart of it.
So I want to talk about a decade ago, one of my former partners and dear friends came to me and said, Max, I just discovered this amazing woman and you need to go learn from her, which I value. I always value. And her name is, not the partner, the woman is Dr. Betty Martin, and she has this thing called the Wheel of Consent. And I'll give you a link that you can put up. And one of the things, I mean, I've done 30 or 40 days of training with Dr. Martin. She's amazing. And the one of the things that I have extracted is there's the notion of looking at an interaction between 2 people and trying to discern who it's for. That when 2 people interact, there's generally a gift that's flowing in one direction or the other, and being clear so both of you understand what the gift is and what direction it's flowing is super powerful and helps avoid a lot of bad communication. As an example, you can imagine me in bed, for instance, going down on a female partner, right? And this is not like a big thing for me, but she's like wiggling around and making the right noises. And so I'm going, okay, I'm going to keep doing this because I'm happy. She's digging it. I'm happy to provide it. And so we do that for a while, and we quit. And we're having the proverbial cigarette, and she says to me, Max, you must love going down on women, because I could have been done a while ago, but I didn't want to make you stop, right? And so here we have a situation where I thought I was giving her a gift, and she thought she was giving me a gift, and we were both wrong, and we kind of wasted our time.
That's fascinating.
Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Absolutely. And it highlights its inverse, if you will, which is the solutioning to this is open and candid, sometimes radically candid
Yeah.
communication, which
Yep.
is checking in. How you doing? What
Yep.
do you want?
And
So,
so noticing the difference between an ask and an offer, right? It's like, would you go down on me, or would you like me to go down on you, or like, I will go down on you if you want, right? And just, there is a whole, I mean, we could spend hours on the technique here, but the concept of figuring out, is there a gift, and do I think I'm giving or receiving, right? And there is exactly one definition of a good gift, and that is that the recipient wants it, right? If I have a sick friend and I have a chicken soup recipe, I'm going to call them up and say, I'm so sorry you're sick. I'm going to make my chicken soup and I'm going to leave it on your doorstep and you're going to feel better, guaranteed, right? And I drive across town and I leave the chicken soup on their doorstep, and I'm going to feel good all day because I gave something, and we're actually wired to give, right? I mean, we've all done this. And if my friend is a vegetarian, it's a bad gift, right? Because chicken.
yeah.
And so, right? And so if they say to me, that sounds great, but don't forget I'm a vegetarian, and I go, no, 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 it's really good. It's my mother's recipe. It's like I may think I'm giving, but they're not receiving. And so picking apart all these situations in our life, and you'll notice that one is utterly not sexual, right? But picking apart who it's for and this notion of giving, receiving is a practice that I've been doing for a decade now, and I'm nowhere near done, right? It's a core part of my coaching practice. So I want to approach this same notion from a slightly different direction to get to the same place, and then I'll pass the baton back to you two. And this is, we talk about consent in it, and we act like the answer is yes or no. It's like, may I touch you? Yes or no, right? Would you like to do this tonight? Right? Yes or no. Even like, you want to go to a movie? Yes or no. And I think, and in fact, there's a movement that is called hell yes consent that kind of says, if someone asks you a thing and you're not like, hell yes, I want to do that, you should just say no. And I think for like 18-year-olds on a college campus thinking about sex, I think hell yes is not a bad standard. It's like, if it's kind of like, hey, do you want to fuck? It's like, I don't know, I guess that'd be fine. My recommendation would be, why don't you not, right? And the world is actually more complex than yes and no. And so this again is from Dr. Betty Martin. And I would suggest that no is always there and it's always available, and it's just like, no, I can't or I won't. It's a complete sentence, as they say. But yes, there are two versions of yes. There is yes, I want to do this, and there's yes, I'm willing to do this. And so, for instance, if my partner calls me and I'm out driving around doing something, and she says, would you stop at the grocery store and pick up a bunch of things on the way home? I am unlikely to be a hell yes to that, right? It's like, yes, I love going to the grocery store and standing in line and all of that. But I'm going to say yes, probably. I'm willing to do it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Right? I might say no because, like, actually, no, I need to get home and get on this podcast. I don't have time, right? There might be a reason to say no, but I have available to me, yes, I'm willing to do a thing, and yes, I want to do a thing. Now, here's the thing. If I say yes, I'm willing to do it, the rest of that sentence is, yes, I'm willing to do it for you. There's a gift. This is that other conversation. So if I say, yes, I'm willing to go down on you, that's a genuine statement of availability on my part, that I'm willing to do it, right? I'm not going to resent it. I'm physically able to do it, but it's a gift. And if you don't want the gift, you should tell me.
I think anyone who's been married for a long time in a traditionally monogamous kind of setting, and again, not to stereotype, would find tremendous relatability in some of these challenges.
Absolutely.
And how you demarcate uh, a zealous embrace of a request from the banal acquiescence of pragmatic expedience is, I think, very revealing, right?
Yep.
And getting to the heart of consent in that way is not only a microcosm between conversations and touch points between people, but in a sense, in a macro sense, gets to the essence of what we're talking about here regarding alternative explorations in intimacy and sexuality, right?
Yeah.
Which is, for years, I've been wanting to get gangbanged. I've just heard Hefe say this out loud, so I'm just, quoting him. But I have been wanting for years to experience some essentially or ostensibly alternative or conventionally exotic experience. That's the heart of who I am and what I want, but I have been unable or unwilling to articulate that request and reach out to the world to explore it. And what we're talking about here, in essence, is the opportunity for that kind of self expression and exploration, and to do it in a way to maximize comfort, minimize risk, and enable folks to keep experimenting, right? Isn't
Yep.
that,
So,
in a
so
sense, what
all of
this
that.
is all about?
So yes to all of that. And also, let's recognize that this discussion of consent can be terrifically complex and can run all sorts of courses. And what we're talking about right now is a consent to something that we're willing to do, or a consent to something that maybe we've wanted to do and haven't communicated. Another example, Max and I have a friend or acquaintance in common. On FetLife, they use the name MetCat. And 10 plus years ago, they shared a writing that their partner had written about consent and about this sort of enthusiastic consent versus a uncertain or reluctant maybe, and how so many of the experiences that many people have that may turn out to be really peak experiences of their life are things that they consented to very reluctantly because, as Max said, yes to you, a partner that they trust, that has created a space where they know that they can say yes to something that they're uncertain about, may lead to an ecstatic experience that they never thought that they were going to enjoy. So there are all sorts of yeses, and the hell yes is terrifically valuable for new relationships, for casual relationships, for relationships among folks that are less experienced, but it is far from telling the whole story.
Yeah. And so I want to tie this now back to power, right? Back to authority. And by the way, that writing, interestingly, was born in my basement dungeon at an unconference event that I sponsored, which I love. If two people want to engage in a relationship where there's deliberate power, where there's authority transfer, right? What that means is they think it's hot, they think it's intellectually stimulating, they think it's sexually arousing. There's value to both of them in playing with power, right? And so if I have a person who's in this relationship with me who likes chocolate ice cream and wants to be, my submissive, to use that language, and I say to them, you, boy, go get some chocolate ice cream right now, in my best dominant tone of voice, they're unlikely to feel particularly like overwhelmed by my power dynamic because they like chocolate ice cream, right? It's like, oh, okay, I'll go have some chocolate ice cream, sir. The place that they feel authority, if they want to feel authority, the place they feel authority is if I say something like, you, boy, no chocolate ice cream for a week. And so if you think about it, the getting chocolate ice cream is a thing they want. The no chocolate ice cream, assuming that we've negotiated that I have limited control over their diet, the no chocolate ice cream is a thing that they don't want, but they're willing to do. And so if you want to play with power, you actually have to spend time in this willing to place to feel it.
And that's part of the dynamic. And it's the heart, to your point again, of consent, which is, hell yes, I'm into this, even if, maybe especially if, it makes me ostensibly uncomfortable, or you bring me pain, or you remind me of your power over me in this situation.
Yeah, it's that reminder, right?
What can we take from this? What can we learn from this? What can we bring into our lives on the day to day? And then add on, some of the stuff that you're working on right now, Max, and how people can take an opportunity to learn from you.
So the things that I would, my benediction here would be, I certainly don't think everybody should be kinky, but I think kink is in fact the most effective way I've ever found to build intimacy. I think it's powerful, it's connective. I think kink can be approached as an activity, kind of as one of you alluded to, is like, hey, here's a thing to do Saturday night instead of going to a movie. And it can also be, for many people, an identity, just like being queer is an identity, right? If you're queer and you're not fucking somebody, you're still queer. Lots of kinky people identify as kinky as part of their identity. And so those opportunities to build intimacy, I think, are really profound. I think they lead to really high quality discussions. Some of the tools for those discussions, I think, are clarity around sort of deconstructing kink, which we didn't really talk about. But for instance, SM, which is about physical play, is very different from DS, which is about playing with authority. Lots of people like to be spanked, but do not want to be told what to do, or vice versa. They're different, and we can combine them, but you don't have to combine them. So that leads to like opportunities for really detailed discussions about what do you like, what do you not like, what do you want, what do you not want. And then with, I think, a little more discussion and sophistication, we have opportunities to not just negotiate what we want and what's a no, but what are we willing to do for our partner, and to learn about and embrace this notion of who's this for, and clarity about what direction the gift is flowing. And then from that, we get like, in a relationship, there should be balance, which doesn't mean each encounter goes both ways, but it means over time, I get some and you get some, right? We want balance in those ways. So my coaching practice is about all those things. I still teach lots of technical skills ranging from erotic hypnosis to rope bondage. And a lot of my discussions are sort of this who's it for thing. And the underlying piece of that, the thing that I might leave people with, is most of us give too much. That it seems our model of the world is that people are rapacious takers, and they just like want to take. And if you look around at the people that you know, and if you look at yourself, I think almost all of us give most of the time. And I think the skill that needs developing, interestingly, is in receiving. And it's it's like, if you give and nobody's receiving, it's like it's a wasted gift, right? And so a lot of my coaching is like, well, what do you actually want to receive? Because that turns out to be a profoundly difficult question. And then how do you enter into relationship with the clarity and the communication to not only give, but to also receive, and to find balance and joy in receiving and in giving?
Well, thanks so much, Max, for joining us on the Bald and Bodacious podcast. As we mentioned, we've got links for your resources, stuff you've referred to, books, your own practice.
Yes.
And listeners can find it in the description of the podcast, wherever podcasts are streamed. Thanks, Max.
Thank you, Max. I'm super grateful for your time and for sharing your experiences with us.
It's a pleasure being involved with you too.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Have a great rest of your weekend. Take care.
You too.